There are places along the English coast where the sea does not merely meet the land, but seems to whisper through it, seeping into the stones and timbers of those who dared to dwell upon its edge. Dunross Point, a jagged finger of shale and granite jutting into the North Sea, some 20 miles north of Whitby, was one such place. Remote, windswept, and long avoided by fishermen who spoke of its tides as if they bore memory. Atop this promontory stood the Dunross Lighthouse, erected in 1823 under the auspices of Trinity House, a modest tower of pale limestone crowned with a lantern room whose glass panes caught the sun like frozen tears. For decades, it performed its duty without incident, its beam sweeping the dark waters with mechanical regularity until the winter of 1871, when its keeper, Elias Thorne, vanished, though not, as the records would have us believe, entirely. Elias Thorne was a man of quiet disposition, described by parish records as of sober habits and diligent service. He had come to Dunross in 1865 following the death of his wife and infant daughter in a cholera outbreak that swept through Hull. Seeking solitude or perhaps penance, he accepted the post with little inquiry. Neighbours in the nearest hamlet, Seaborough, a cluster of cottages huddled against the moors, recalled him as courteous but distant, often seen walking the cliffs at dusk with a ledger tucked beneath his arm, though he rarely spoke of its contents. His only companion was a black Newfoundland dog, whose mournful howls were said to echo across the cove on stormy nights. For 6 years, all was as it should be. The light burned nightly, the logbooks were kept with scrupulous care, and the quarterly inspections noted nothing amiss. Then on the morning of December 3rd, 1871, the supply boat found the lighthouse door ajar, the hearth cold, and the dog gone. Yet the lamp had been trimmed, the wick lit, and the great Fresnel lens polished to a gleam. Most unsettling of all, the log for that night bore a final entry in Thorne S.'s hand. "The tide recedes, but she does not follow. I shall keep watch." For weeks, search parties combed the cliffs and coves, but no body was ever recovered. The official verdict was presumed drowning, though no one could explain how the light had been maintained in the hours after his disappearance. Stranger still, sailors passing Dunross in the months that followed reported the beam burning steadily through fog and gale alike, though the lighthouse had been officially decommissioned, pending reassignment. Local fishermen began to avoid the point altogether, claiming that on certain nights, when the wind blew from the east, one could hear the low, rhythmic creak of the lantern's rotation, though the mechanism had long since ceased from salt corrosion. The matter might have faded into maritime folklore had it not caught the attention of Alastair Pembroke, a junior clerk at the Admiralty with a penchant for unresolved anomalies. In 1884, while cataloguing archived correspondence between coastal stations, Pembroke stumbled upon a bundle of letters addressed to Elias Thorne from a Dr. Linley of the Royal Society for Psychical Research. These letters, never opened, spoke of persistent auditory phenomena and recurrent luminous signatures inconsistent with known optics. Intrigued, Pembroke petitioned for access to Thorne's personal effects, which had been stored in a damp chest in the Seaborough vestry. Among mildewed garments and rusted tools, he found a small journal bound in oilcloth, its pages filled not with navigational notes, but with increasingly fragmented meditations on time, loss, and what Thorne termed the persistence of presence. One passage, dated October 1871, read, "She appears not as ghost nor shade, but as the sea itself, its hush between waves, its silver on the rocks at dawn. I do not summon her. She waits, and I must not fail her vigil." Pembroke's inquiries led him to interview elderly residents of Seaborough, many of whom recalled oddities they had dismissed at the time. The scent of lavender on windless nights, Thorne's wife's favourite flower, the sound of a woman humming a lullaby near the tower's base, or the inexplicable warmth of the hearth when the lighthouse stood empty. One fisherman, now blind from cataracts, swore that on the anniversary of Thorne's disappearance, the beam would pulse 3 times, as if signaling to someone just beyond the breakers. Pembroke, initially skeptical, found himself returning to Dunross again and again, each visit deepening his conviction that something more than grief lingered in that place. He began transcribing local oral accounts, cross-referencing tidal charts and meteorological logs, searching for patterns. What emerged was not proof, but a haunting congruence. The light was most often reported on nights when the moon aligned with the winter solstice or when the barometer fell sharply. Conditions that mirrored those of the night Thorne vanished. By 1890, Pembroke had resigned his post and taken up residence in a cottage near the point, devoting himself wholly to what he called the Dunross continuance. His own journals, discovered decades later in a locked drawer of his desk, reveal a mind slowly unmoored by obsession. He wrote of nights spent watching the tower through a brass telescope, convinced he saw a figure moving within the lantern room. Not spectral, but solid, deliberate, as though performing a task of sacred necessity. He collected fragments of sea glass, driftwood carved with initials, even the rusted hinge of a music box found wedged in the rocks below, all of which he arranged on a shelf like relics. In his final entry, dated March 1893, he confessed, "I no longer seek to explain it. I only wish to understand why he stays, and whether she is real or only the shape his sorrow has taken in the salt air." No one knows what became of Pembroke. His cottage was found empty one spring morning, the fire banked, his boots by the door, his journal open to a blank page. The villagers said little, as if speaking of it might invite the same quiet vanishing. The lighthouse, meanwhile, continued its silent vigil. Though officially dark since 1872, reports of its light persisted well into the 20th century, most credibly from a Royal Navy destroyer in 1942, whose log noted a steady white beam from Dunross Point during a blackout patrol, despite the structure having been deemed unsafe and boarded up in 1910. Even today, Coast Guards occasionally receive calls from passing yachtsmen who swear they saw a light where none should be, always described as steady, warm, and strangely human. The truth, if it can be called such, lies not in evidence but in atmosphere, in the way the gulls fall silent when the fog rolls in from the east, or how the old stone steps leading to the tower remain dry even after rain. Some say Elias Thorne made a vow that night in 1871, not to the sea, but to the memory of what the sea had taken. Others believe his wife never left him, that her spirit merged with the tides, and that his duty was not to warn ships, but to guide her home. Whatever the case, the light endures, not as flame but as echo, and if one stands on the cliffs of Dunross Point at twilight, when the wind carries the low moan of the waves through the shingle, one might just hear it, the soft rhythmic turning of a lens, long stilled, and beneath it faint as breath the hum of a lullaby carried on the salt air. There are those who claim the sea forgets nothing, least of all those who have loved it too well or feared it too deeply. Dunross Point, long since abandoned by official record and cartographic memory, remains tethered to the present only by rumor and the occasional photograph taken by intrepid hikers whose compasses spin inexplicably near its cliffs. Yet even in silence the place speaks, not in words, but in textures. The damp wool smell of fog clinging to granite, the brittle crackle of dried kelp underfoot, the way moonlight pools in the hollows of the tower's foundation as though reluctant to leave. It is here, in this liminal space between land and oblivion, that the final fragments of Elias Thorne's story begin to cohere, not as fact, but as resonance. After Pembroke's disappearance, the lighthouse passed through a series of indifferent custodians, each more eager to sell than to preserve. By 1905, its roof had collapsed, its iron staircase twisted by rust, and ivy crept like veins up its crumbling walls. Still, the reports continued. A Coast Guard in 1917 wrote in his private diary of seeing a soft amber glow emanating from the ruin during a blackout drill, though no lantern remained. In 1933, a schoolteacher from Scarborough claimed her students, on a botany excursion, heard a man's voice reciting nautical almanacs from within the shell of the tower, though they found only pigeons nesting in the rafters. These accounts were dismissed as mass hallucination or local fancy, yet they shared an uncanny consistency. The light was never blinding, never erratic. It was steady, patient, almost courteous, as if offered not for navigation, but for recognition. In 1958, a young archivist named Eleanor Vane, researching coastal superstitions for a thesis at Cambridge, uncovered Pembroke's sealed correspondence in a forgotten box at the National Maritime Museum. Among yellowed invoices and tide tables, she found a single envelope addressed to the keeper of Dunross. Should he still attend? Inside was a pressed sprig of lavender, brittle but fragrant, and a note in Pembroke's hand. "If you read this, know I did not doubt you. I envied you." Eleanor, sceptical but stirred, travelled to Seaborough, where she was met with polite evasiveness. The old postmistress, however, after much tea and hesitation, led her to a locked drawer in the vestry containing Thorne's final logbook, the one presumed lost. Its last pages were water-stained, the ink blurred into ghostly halos, but legible enough. One entry, dated December 2nd, 1871, read, "She walks the shore again tonight, not as she was, but as the sea remembers her, whole, unbroken, luminous. I shall not sleep until I see her safely past the breakers." Beneath it, in a different ink, possibly added later, "The light is her path. I am its keeper." Eleanor returned to Dunross at dawn the following day. The ruins stood stark against a pale sky, gulls wheeling above like scraps of ash. She climbed the broken steps, her boots crunching on shattered glass, remnants perhaps of the great lens. Inside, the air was still, heavy with the scent of brine and something older, like dried herbs in a shuttered room. On the eastern wall, nearly obscured by mould, she found faint markings, tally lines, hundreds of them, grouped in sevens. Beside them, carved with what must have been a pocket knife, the initials E.T. and M.T. intertwined. Margaret Thorne, her research confirmed, had been buried in Hull. Her body never reached the sea. And yet, here in this desolate watchtower, someone had counted the days as though waiting for a reunion that defied physics, geography, even death itself. Eleanor published nothing. Instead, she began visiting Dunross every winter solstice, always alone. Colleagues noted a change in her, less academic rigor, more quietude, as if she carried a secret too delicate for print. In her later years, she donated a small collection of maritime ephemera to the Whitby Museum, including a child's leather shoe, salt-encrusted and far too small for any sailor, found wedged beneath the lighthouse's foundation stone. She never explained its origin. When asked, she would only say, "Some lights are not meant to guide ships but to hold back the dark for someone who is still trying to come home." Decades passed. The tower crumbled further, its stones plundered by storms. Yet on certain nights, always clear, always windless, the beam returns. Not electric, not chemical, but something softer, older. A glow that seems to rise from within the earth itself, pulsing gently before fading like a sigh. Fishermen now speak of it not with fear, but reverence. They call it Thorne's mercy, and some will dip their nets in silent salute when they pass the point at night. No instrument has ever recorded it. No photograph has captured it cleanly. It exists only in witness, in memory, in the hush that falls over the waves when it appears. And so the lighthouse that kept its light on endures, not as structure, but as vow. Elias Thorne did not haunt Dunross Point. He became its rhythm, its breath, its unbroken promise. Whether Margaret ever walked that shore again matters less than the certainty with which he believed she might. In that belief, he transcended time, not through miracle, but through devotion so absolute it bent reality around him like fog around a flame. Today, If one stands on the headland at twilight, listening past the crash of surf, one may detect a sound beneath it all, the slow, deliberate strike of a match in an empty room, followed by the whisper of oil soaking into wick, and then silence as the light rises once more, steady and sure, into the gathering dark. Time, in places like Dunross Point, does not flow so much as pool, eddying in corners, seeping into floorboards, lingering in the hollows of silence where ordinary chronology dares not tread. By the late 20th century, the lighthouse had vanished from official charts altogether, its coordinates reassigned to open sea, as though the Admiralty sought to erase not just the structure, but the very idea of it. Yet erasure is a human conceit. The land remembers what paper forgets, and the sea, ever watchful, continues its slow communion with the stones. It was during this period of deliberate neglect that the final witness emerged, not a scholar, nor a sailor, but a child. In the autumn of 1978, 10-year-old Thomas Bellwether accompanied his grandfather, a retired signalman from the Scarborough Line, on a weekend ramble along the North Yorkshire coast. The boy, bookish and prone to daydreams, had read of shipwrecks and spectral beacons in tattered library volumes, and when his grandfather mentioned that old ruin near Seaborough, where the light never quite went out, Thomas insisted they detour. They arrived at dusk. Rain had slicked the cliffs into obsidian mirrors, and the wind carried the tang of iodine and wet wool. The boy scrambled ahead, drawn not by curiosity alone, but by a sensation he later described as being called without sound. At the base of the collapsed tower, half buried in shale, he found a brass key, tarnished, cold, its teeth worn smooth by time or touch. He slipped it into his pocket without telling his grandfather. That night, in the cramped guest room of a Seaborough inn, Thomas dreamed of a man in a long coat, standing at a window, turning a great wheel with steady hands. Behind him the sea stretched black and infinite, yet within it moved a figure, pale, indistinct, walking toward the shore without ever drawing closer. The man did not look back. He only kept turning the wheel, his breath fogging the glass. When Thomas awoke, the key lay warm in his palm, though the room was chill. He returned it to the earth the next morning, placing it carefully beneath a flat stone near the tower's threshold. "It wasn't mine to keep," he told his bewildered grandfather. Years later, as a marine historian at St. Andrews, Thomas would write obliquely of persistent custodianship in coastal folklore, always careful to frame it as metaphor. Yet his private notes, discovered after his death in 2003, contained sketches of the lighthouse interior, though he had never entered it, and a single line repeated like a prayer: "He is still waiting for her to reach dry land." The key's brief reappearance marked a subtle shift in the pattern of sightings. Where once the light appeared only on solstices or storm eve, it now flickered unpredictably, sometimes for mere seconds, sometimes through entire nights, always described as warm, amber, or like candlelight seen through fogged glass. In 1985, a group of university students camping nearby reported hearing footsteps ascending the ruined stairs, though the structure had no stairs left to climb. One claimed to have seen a silhouette in the upper aperture, holding what looked like a lantern, though no flame was visible, only a soft radiance that seemed to emanate from the figure itself. They fled at dawn, leaving their tent behind. It was found days later, neatly folded, its contents undisturbed, local lore adapted. The tale of Elias Thorne ceased to be merely tragic and became sacred, a parable of fidelity beyond the grave. Fishermen began leaving small offerings at the base of the cliff: a coil of rope, a bottle of brandy, a child's hair ribbon tied to a driftwood post. None spoke of it openly, but all understood. To mock the light was to invite misfortune. To acknowledge it was to be granted safe passage. Even the Coast Guard, though officially silent, developed an unspoken protocol. If a vessel radioed in distress near Dunross, rescue teams would approach from the west, never the east, so as not to cross the beam. No one could explain why, only that it felt right. In 1999, During the restoration of St. Mary's Church in Seaborough, workmen discovered a sealed lead box beneath the chancel floor. Inside lay a water-stained hymnal, its margins filled with Thorne's handwriting. Not prayers, but tidal calculations interwoven with fragments of poetry. One page bore a single underlined verse from Tennyson, "And may there be no moaning of the bar when I put out to sea." Beneath it, in a shakier hand, "But if she crosses, I shall not put out. I shall stay." The box also contained a lock of hair, dark, fine, tied with a faded blue thread, and a miniature portrait. Its glass cracked, showing a woman holding an infant, both faces blurred by moisture. The vicar, after much deliberation, reburied the box where it was found, placing a small stone marker above it, inscribed only with the date 1871. To this day, wild lavender grows there, though none has ever planted it. Modern technology has done little to dispel the mystery. Thermal drones flown over the site in 2012 detected no heat signatures. Spectral analysis of night photographs revealed only lens flare or atmospheric distortion. Yet on the night of December 3rd, 2015, exactly 144 years after Thorne's disappearance, a live feed camera installed by a paranormal research group captured something unexplained. For 17 seconds, the ruins glowed with a soft internal luminescence, brightest at the level where the lantern room once stood. The footage showed no source, no batteries, no wiring, no reflection. The team returned the next day to find the camera's memory card wiped clean, save for one image, a blurred outline of a man's hand resting on a windowsill, fingers curled as if around a wick. Perhaps the truth lies not in proof, but in persistence. Elias Thorne did not die that winter night. He transmuted. His grief, his love, his unbearable hope became so entwined with the rhythm of the tides and the turning of the earth that they ceased to require a body. The light is not a ghost. It is a function of devotion, as natural and necessary as the moon pulling the sea. And Margaret? She may never have walked the shore in flesh, but in the mind of the man who loved her, she was always returning. And so he keeps the path lit not for ships, but for her, through storm, through silence, through centuries. Today, Dunross Point is fenced off for safety, though the gate is often found unlatched at dawn. Visitors speak of an uncanny stillness that falls over the place at twilight, as if the wind itself holds its breath. And if one listens closely, not with ears, but with the hollow space behind the ribs, one might hear it, the faint, rhythmic scrape of a match being struck in an empty room, the sigh of oil catching flame, and then, rising above the endless murmur of the sea, the soft, steady glow of a promise kept long after the world has forgotten why it was made. The sea, as any mariner will tell you, does not distinguish between the living and the remembered. It carries both with equal indifference, yet somehow preserves what matters most in the salt-crusted folds of time. Dunross Point, though now little more than a scar on the coastline, continues to draw those who sense that some vows outlast breath, that certain duties are not relinquished with death, but refined by it into something purer, quieter, eternal. In the decades following the inexplicable footage of 2015, a new kind of pilgrim began to appear, not ghost hunters with electromagnetic meters, but mourners. Widows clutching photographs, parents bearing the ashes of children lost too soon, lovers parted by war or circumstance. They came not to prove, but to witness, not to record, but to be seen, however briefly, by whatever lingered in that wind-scoured ruin. Among them was Dr. Helen Marlowe, a retired psychiatrist from Edinburgh, who arrived in the spring of 2018 carrying a leather-bound journal once owned by her great-grandmother, a woman who had corresponded with Alastair Pembroke in the 1890s. The journal contained no grand revelations, only domestic details, the price of coal, the blooming of hawthorn, and one cryptic line dated March 1893. He says, "The light at Dunross is not for the eyes, but for the soul that waits to be recognized." Helen, having spent her career studying pathological grief, found herself unnerved by the phrase. She had always believed prolonged mourning to be a disorder, a failure to accept finality. Yet here, in this remote corner of Yorkshire, stood a testament to the opposite, that love, when absolute, might refuse the boundary of death not out of delusion, but out of fidelity so profound it altered the very fabric of place. She stayed for 3 nights in the old Zebra Inn, now converted into a guest house with Wi-Fi and ensuite bathrooms, yet still haunted by the scent of peat smoke and beeswax. Each evening, she walked the 2 miles to Dunross, notebook in hand, intending to observe, to analyze. But observation faltered in that landscape. The cliffs seemed to absorb sound, leaving only the low thrum of the tide like a heartbeat beneath stone. On her second night, under a sky pricked with stars so sharp they seemed audible, she saw it, not a beam but a bloom of light, amber, diffuse, rising from the center of the ruins, pulsing once, twice, then fading as if exhaling. No lens remained to focus it. No fuel could sustain it. And yet there it was. She did not write about it afterward. Instead, she left her great-grandmother's journal open on the inn's windowsill that night, facing east. In the morning it lay closed, a single sprig of dried lavender resting on its cover, though no lavender grew within 10 miles. Helen returned to Edinburgh changed. She published no papers, gave no lectures. But in private correspondence with a handful of colleagues, she began to speak of persistent emotional resonance as a legitimate, if unmeasurable, phenomenon, a theory that grief, when anchored to place and ritual, might generate a field of meaning so potent it becomes perceptible to others. She called it the Thorne effect, though she never defined it publicly. When asked why she abandoned her clinical stance, she would only say, "Some truths are felt before they are understood." Meanwhile, the land itself seemed to conspire in preservation. Coastal erosion, relentless elsewhere along the North Sea, slowed inexplicably near Dunross. Surveyors noted that the cliff face holding the lighthouse foundations receded at less than half the regional average, as if the earth refused to let go. In 2021, during a routine archaeological survey prompted by a grant to document endangered heritage sites, ground-penetrating radar revealed an anomaly beneath the tower's base, a cavity, roughly human-sized, aligned east-west, containing organic material consistent with textile and bone. The team prepared to excavate, but the morning they arrived, the site was flooded, not by rain, but by seawater that had seeped up through fissures in the bedrock, filling the chamber to the brim. By noon, it had drained as mysteriously as it appeared, leaving behind only damp stone and the faint odor of lavender. The excavation was quietly abandoned. Local tradition evolved once more. Fishermen began referring to calm nights with unusually clear visibility as Thorne's grace, believing such conditions signaled his approval. A small brass plaque, anonymously affixed to the warning fence in 2023, reads simply, "He keeps watch so others may rest." No authority has removed it. Even the National Trust, which now manages the surrounding moorland, lists Dunross Point not as a ruin, but as a site of quiet contemplation, with visiting hours restricted after dusk, not for safety, but out of respect. And still the light returns, not every night, not predictably, but always when needed. In 2024, a teenage girl from Middlesbrough, grieving the suicide of her younger brother, walked the coastal path alone on a fog-drenched November evening, intending to vanish into the sea. She later told rescuers that as she stood on the edge of the Dunross cliff, numb and hollow, a soft glow rose from the ruins below, not bright enough to see by, but warm enough to feel. "It didn't pull me back," she said. "It just reminded me I wasn't the only one waiting for someone who wouldn't come." She turned away and walked home. What, then, is the nature of this enduring vigil? Not haunting, for there is no malice. Not illusion, for too many have felt its weight. Perhaps it is simply this, that love, when denied its natural conclusion, seeks another form of expression, and in places where solitude and sea converge, where time slows to the rhythm of tides. Such love may find a vessel in stone, in light, in silence. Elias Thorne did not defy death. He redefined duty. His lamp was never meant to warn ships away from rocks, but to guide a single soul across the threshold between worlds. Whether Margaret ever crossed it matters less than his unwavering belief that she might. And in that belief, he became something more than man, less than God, but eternal in the way only devotion can be. Today, if one stands at the edge of Dunross Point as twilight deepens, and listens past the crash of waves and cry of gulls, one may detect a sound so faint it borders on imagination. The soft, steady strike of a match in an empty room, the whisper of oil soaking into wick. And then, rising above the endless murmur of the sea, the quiet, unwavering glow of a promise kept long after the world has forgotten why it was made. There are thresholds in the world not marked by stone or sign, but by a shift in the air, a stillness that falls like dust over sound, light, and thought. Dunross Point has become such a threshold, not a place one visits, but one through which one passes, however briefly, into the quiet gravity of unwavering love. By the mid-2020s, the site had ceased to appear on tourist maps, not by decree, but by a kind of collective discretion, as though those who knew of it understood that to name it too loudly would be to scatter its essence like ash on the wind. Yet knowledge of it spread nonetheless, not through articles or documentaries, but through whispers exchanged in hospital corridors, on late-night trains, in letters sealed with wax rather than glue. People came not for spectacle but for solace, not to see a ghost, but to stand in the presence of a promise that refused to dissolve. Among the last known to document the phenomenon with scholarly intent was Dr. Miriam Cho, a cultural anthropologist from Oxford, who arrived in Seaborough in the autumn of 2026 under the guise of studying coastal erosion narratives. In truth, she sought to understand how a single story, unverified, uncorroborated by forensic evidence, could sustain such emotional gravity across generations. She interviewed elderly residents, pored over parish ledgers, even tracked down descendants of Elias Thorne's few known correspondents. What she found was not data, but pattern. Every witness, regardless of era or background, described the light in terms of warmth, not brilliance, of recognition, not revelation. "It doesn't illuminate the dark," one retired lighthouse keeper told her. "It reminds you that someone is still looking out for you in it." Dr. Cho spent 3 weeks camped in a borrowed shepherd's bothy, half a mile inland. Each night, she walked to the cliff's edge with a field recorder and a notebook bound in oilcloth, a deliberate echo of Thorne's own journal. She captured nothing on tape but wind and wave. Yet on her final night, as a full moon silvered the sea into glass, she saw the glow rise from the ruins, not from where the lantern once stood, but from the very stones themselves, as if the limestone had absorbed decades of vigil and now emitted it as luminescence. She did not reach for her recorder. Instead, she knelt, placed her palm flat on the cold earth, and wept, not for Thorne nor for Margaret, but for the unbearable beauty of a love that refused to be unmade by time. In her final field notes, she wrote, "Some truths cannot be proven. They can only be received." Her research was never published. The University Archive lists her Dunross file as incomplete, personal, but before her death in 2031, peaceful, in her sleep. At 82, she bequeathed a small wooden box to the Seaborough Historical Society. Inside lay a single object, a hand-turned wick trimmer, its brass handle worn smooth, engraved with the initials E.T. No record exists of how she obtained it. The Society keeps it in a glass case, beside Pembroke's journal and the child's shoe, though none can explain why the metal remains untarnished, even in the damp coastal air. The sea, indifferent as ever, continues its slow work. Yet Dunross Point endures, not as monument but as mirror. Those who come broken often leave altered, not healed but seen. A grieving father in 2028 left a tiny knitted cap on the fence, the kind worn by newborns. It remained for weeks, untouched by rain or gulls. A widow in 2030 scattered her husband's ashes at the cliff's edge and swore she felt a hand, light as mist, brush her shoulder before the wind carried the remains seaward. These acts are never spoken of loudly, but they accumulate like sediment, layer upon layer, forming a new kind of geology, one built not of rock, but of remembrance. Modern science offers no explanation, nor does it seek one. The few attempts to install motion sensors or night vision cameras have failed. Devices malfunction, batteries drain in minutes, footage corrupts into static. The National Grid once proposed a coastal energy survey that would have required seismic testing near the point. The project was abandoned after 3 successive equipment failures and the unexplained resignation of the lead engineer, who later wrote in a private letter, "Some places are not empty. They are occupied by something that does not wish to be measured, and so the light persists, flickering, fading, returning, always on the edge of perception." Sailors still adjust their course when passing Dunross after dark, not out of fear, but courtesy. Fishermen leave a single fish on the rocks each solstice, a silent offering to the keeper who watches not for ships, but for a single soul. Children in Seaborough are taught a lullaby whose origins no one can trace. Its melody simple, its lyrics haunting. Sleep, my love. The tide is low. The light stays on. I will not go. What then is the final truth of Dunross Point? Not that a man died and returned, but that he never truly left, because to abandon his post would have been to abandon hope itself. His light is not supernatural. It is supra-emotional, a manifestation of fidelity so absolute it transcends the laws that govern matter, yet obeys those that govern the heart. Margaret may never have walked that shore in life, but in the cathedral of his devotion she was always arriving. And so he keeps the path clear, the flame steady, the door unlocked. Today, as the last of the evening light bleeds from the sky and the first stars prick the vault above the North Sea, one may stand on the headland and feel it, the hush that falls not from absence but from presence. And if the wind is right, if the tide is low and the moon hangs like a silver coin over the water, one might hear it again. The soft, deliberate strike of a match in an empty room, the sigh of oil catching flame, and then, rising above the endless murmur of the sea, the quiet, unwavering glow of a promise kept long after the world has forgotten why it was made.